The desert had a way of testing souls. Its vast stretches of red rock and endless sand didn't care if a person was strong or weak, rich or poor. It stripped them down to their core. For Clara, it had stripped her down to almost nothing. The young woman stumbled forward, her dress torn at the hem, boots coated with dust, and throat so dry that every breath was a knife against her lungs. She had left town at dawn, desperate to escape the voices that never stopped, voices that told her she was worthless, a burden, too fragile to stand on her own. They had laughed when she said she wanted freedom, mocked her when she dreamed of love. She had walked away with no plan except to be far from the people who had chained her spirit. But now, under the burning sun, her courage faltered. The desert was unforgiving, and Clara realized how unprepared she was. Hours of wandering had sapped her strength. Her vision blurred. She slipped on loose gravel near a dry arroyo, her knees buckling beneath her. Dust clouded around her as she fell, coughing, choking, trying to rise. The horizon wavered with heat, and for a moment, she thought she saw a dark figure moving among the rocks. She blinked hard, thinking it was a trick of her failing sight. But the figure drew closer, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the silence of a predator. Not a mirage. Not a ghost, not an Apache warrior. Her heart jolted. She had heard the whispers in town, stories meant to frighten children and keep women in their place. They spoke of Apaches as shadows in the night, ruthless, merciless. But as the man came into focus, Clara saw no monster. His hair, long and black as midnight, caught the dying light of the sun. His eyes, dark and piercing, studied her with an intensity that made her shiver. He carried himself with quiet strength, every motion controlled, measured, purposeful. Clara tried to rise, but her legs gave out beneath her. Her voice broke, small and desperate. "Please, don't leave." The words slipped from her lips before she even thought of them. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the raw terror of being alone in the vast emptiness. But more than that, it was a plea born of something deeper. She wasn't begging for her life. Not really. She was begging not to be abandoned again, not to be discarded as she always had been. The Apache paused. For a long, silent moment, he simply looked at her, this pale, trembling woman on the edge of collapse. Something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped forward. Clara's breath caught as he crouched before her. His presence was overwhelming, like the desert itself, dangerous, vast, unyielding. She half expected him to turn away, to leave her in the dust as others had done. Instead, he reached down and lifted her hand. Her skin was fevered, trembling. His touch was calloused but steady, grounding her in a way she hadn't known was possible. And in that brief contact, her fragile hand within his strong grasp, he felt something stir within himself. It had been years since Lone Hawk had let himself feel anything beyond duty and survival. His life had been built on silence and shadow, on protecting what little remained of his people after loss and betrayal had scarred them. He had trained himself to keep his heart guarded, to see outsiders as threats, never as souls worth saving. But as he held the woman's hand, as he looked into her eyes wide with fear and pleading, his heartbeat quickened against his will. He could not explain it, only that her voice, broken yet unyielding, had reached a part of him he thought long buried. For Clara, that moment felt like the world had shifted. She had expected coldness or rejection. Instead, there was warmth, silent but undeniable, flowing from his hand into hers. Tears pricked her eyes, not from fear, but from the fragile spark of hope. The desert around them was still, save for the whisper of the wind through the canyon stones. Two strangers, worlds apart, had collided in that silence, one too broken to rise, the other too guarded to love. And yet, in the small act of lifting her hand, the Apache warrior had unknowingly taken hold of more than just flesh and bone. he had taken hold of her trust. And in the racing of his own heart, he realized she had taken hold of something within him too. The desert did not often give second chances. But in that moment, under the unforgiving sky, Clara and Lone Hawk had found one. The night after their first meeting, Clara awoke in the canyon with the taste of fear still heavy on her tongue. She had expected the Apache warrior to vanish once he had steadied her, as though he might dissolve back into the desert shadows. But when she opened her eyes, she saw him nearby, crouched by a small fire, the flames painting sharp angles across his face. He did not speak at first. He simply watched the stars, silent as the land itself. Clara drew her knees to her chest, wrapping her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders. The firelight should have been comforting, but memories haunted her more fiercely than the cold. She had not run from town because of one cruel word or one unkind glance. It had been years of small betrayals, each one cutting deeper until her spirit felt raw and exposed. She thought of her father, a man hardened by whiskey and disappointment. When her mother had died, Clara became the unwanted reminder of everything he had lost. Too weak, he'd call her when she dropped a pail or stumbled while carrying wood. No man will ever keep you. Each word had burrowed into her chest until she believed it. The townsfolk had not been gentler. They saw her as fragile, clumsy, a girl unfit for the life of hard desert survival. Suitors had looked once, then turned away. She was left behind, always left behind. Her escape had not been about rebellion, it had been about survival. The day she fled, the sound of laughter from men on the porch of the saloon still echoed in her head. They had mocked her dreams, telling her she'd be lucky if any man took her out of pity. That laughter had followed her into the wilderness. Now here she was, beside a stranger who owed her nothing. She wondered if he saw her the same way, weak, lost, foolish. The thought made her throat tighten. Across the fire, Lone Hawk sat in stillness, but his thoughts were far from calm. The woman's presence had stirred memories he rarely allowed himself to feel. His people once had thrived where the desert stretched wide villages of laughter, children running free, fires burning bright with songs and stories. Then the raids came. Settlers pushed farther into Apache lands, bringing rifles and iron law. Soldiers had stormed their village when he was a boy, flames devouring homes, gunfire tearing through the night. He had watched his mother fall, his younger brother vanish in the chaos. Since that night, Lone Hawk had carried his people's wounds as his own. Survival became his creed, trust a weakness he could not afford. He had grown into a warrior, hard and unyielding. His heart was a locked fortress, guarded by duty. He told himself there was no room for softness, no place for fragile feelings. Yet tonight, looking across the fire at Clara, he felt cracks forming in the stone walls of his soul. He had not meant to care. She was an outsider, a woman from the very world that had tried to destroy his people. And still, her voice when she had pleaded, "Please don't leave," echoed inside him. It was not the cry of someone spoiled or helpless. It was the cry of someone abandoned too many times, someone who wanted, for once in her life, to be chosen. Clara dared to speak. Her voice was small, but it carried through the still canyon air. "Why? Why didn't you leave me there?" Lone Hawk's gaze shifted to her, his eyes deep and unreadable. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, with the weight of truth, he answered simply, "Because I know what it is, to be left behind." The words struck her like an arrow. In them, she heard years of grief, the echo of loneliness she knew too well. It was strange two people from worlds so far apart, yet bound by the same wound. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy with understanding. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. For the first time in years, she did not feel small or pitied. She felt seen. The fire burned lower, and the desert night grew colder. Lone Hawk rose, lifting a blanket from his pack. Without a word, he draped it gently around her shoulders. His hands brushed against her arms, brief, careful, yet sparking warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For Clara, that moment was more powerful than any grand promise. He had offered her kindness without demand, shelter without judgment. For Lone Hawk, he realized he had crossed a line within himself. He was no longer looking at her as an outsider. She was something else, something that pulled at him. Both dangerous and undeniable. The night deepened, stars glittering above them like ancient watchers. Two souls, scarred and weary, sat together by the fire. Neither spoke of love, not yet. But in the quiet, their wounds recognized each other, and the first fragile threads of healing began to weave. The canyon was quiet when dawn crept across the horizon. The first shafts of light painted the cliffs in gold and crimson, while the desert wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush. Clara stirred beneath the blanket Lone Hawk had given her. She opened her eyes to see him already awake, perched on a ledge above, scanning the horizon as if the world itself might rise against them. For a moment, she only studied him. The sharp lines of his face, the stillness of his body, the way the early light gleamed against the long strands of his dark hair. He seemed more a figure of the desert than a man. Unmoving, patient, eternal. She wondered if he ever truly rested, or if duty alone kept him upright. When he returned to the fire, she tried to rise, but her legs wobbled. He steadied her without a word, and though his touch was brief, her heart betrayed her with its quickened rhythm. Where will we go? She asked. He considered her for a moment before answering. My people have a camp not far from here. They will give you food, shelter. The thought made Clara's chest tighten. She had heard how white women were treated if they fell into Apache hands whispered tales in the saloon of captivity and cruelty. But when she looked at Lone Hawk, she could not make herself believe those stories. Still, fear lingered, mixing with a strange thread of trust. The journey to the camp was grueling. The desert sun rose hot, baking the earth until the ground shimmered. Lone Hawk moved effortlessly across the terrain as if the land itself parted for him. Clara stumbled often, her boots catching on stones. But each time she faltered, he slowed his pace. Adjusting to her weakness without complaint. By the time they descended into a hidden hollow between jagged cliffs, Clara was near collapse. Yet what she saw there stole the breath from her chest. Teepees rose in a circle, their hides painted with bold symbols that seemed to whisper of ancient stories. Smoke curled from small fires, carrying the scent of roasted maize. Children darted between the lodges, their laughter bright against the backdrop of stone. Women bent over pots and hides, their hands quick and sure. Warriors moved like shadows, some sharpening arrows, others tending to horses tethered nearby. This was not the savage chaos she had been taught to fear. It was a community living, breathing, bound together by a quiet strength. But as Lone Hawk led her into the camp, Clara felt every eye turned toward her. The laughter of children hushed. Women stilled their work. Even the warriors paused, their gazes sharpening. Clara's pulse raced. She wanted to shrink into herself, to disappear beneath their scrutiny. A woman with silver-threaded braids stepped forward. Her gaze keen as an eagle's. She studied Clara with neither hostility nor welcome, only the weight of judgment. Her words, sharp and rapid, were directed at Lone Hawk. Clara could not understand the language, but she understood the tone. It was questioning, wary. Lone Hawk replied evenly, his voice low but firm. Whatever he said seemed to ease some of the tension, though not all. The silver-haired woman looked at Clara once more before nodding and turning away. Clara exhaled a shaky breath. "They don't want me here," she whispered. "They fear what they do not know," Lone Hawk said. "But they will not harm you. You are under my protection." His words settled into her like a lifeline. She clung to them as he guided her toward a fire where an older woman offered her a wooden bowl filled with broth. Clara hesitated before taking it, but hunger overcame her doubt. The warm liquid slid down her throat, and she nearly wept with relief. That night, she sat by the communal fire, listening to the murmur of voices around her. The children's laughter returned, the women spoke in tones that wove comfort into the night, and the warriors' deep voices rumbled like distant thunder. Slowly, the camp's rhythm wrapped around her, softening the ache in her chest. But what steadied her most was the sight of Lone Hawk across the flames. Though he kept his distance, his presence was a silent promise. She noticed how he watched her, not with suspicion nor pity, but with something steadier, something she had never known in another's gaze. For the first time in her life, Clara felt the stirrings of belonging. She was still an outsider, yes, and the path ahead was uncertain. But here, in this canyon camp beneath the vast desert sky, she was not mocked, not cast aside. She was alive, sheltered, given space to breathe, and in the quiet of the firelight, she began to laugh again, soft at first, then fuller, freer. The sound startled her, as if it belonged to another woman entirely. Across the fire, Lone Hawk heard her laughter, and something in his chest tightened. He had not realized how much he missed that sound in the world, the sound of joy breaking through silence. He lowered his eyes, but his heart betrayed him, beating faster than it should. She was not his. She was not meant to be his. And yet, with every passing moment, she was becoming a flame he could not ignore. The days bled into one another in the canyon, each sunrise casting long shadows across the red cliffs. Each night surrendering to a sky so heavy with stars it seemed the heavens leaned close to listen. For Clara, time moved differently here. In town, every hour had been marked by cruel laughter, by the endless weight of not belonging. Here, in Lone Hawk's world, silence became a balm, and her spirit began to stretch as though testing wings it had never been allowed to use. Lone Hawk rarely spoke more than he needed to, but he never left her side for long. He showed her how to grind maize on a flat stone, how to draw water from a hidden spring. When she faltered, his patience did not waver. When she grew frustrated, his calm only deepened. His presence was a steady rhythm, strong as the heartbeat of the earth itself. It was on the third evening that he invited her to ride. Clara's hand shook as she approached the tall, dark horse tethered near the edge of camp. I've never done this before," she admitted, her cheeks warming. Lone Hawk gave a small nod, lifting her by the waist as if she weighed no more than a feather. The sudden closeness, the strength in his touch, stole her breath. She sat awkwardly at first, clutching the mane, her fear written plain across her face. "Do not hold the horse," he said quietly. "Hold the earth beneath." She frowned, not understanding, but then felt his hand cover hers on the reins, steady and sure. With his guidance, the horse moved forward. Clara gasped at the sway of motion, then slowly, miraculously, found her balance. The desert stretched wide around them, the wind whipping strands of her hair free. For the first time in years, she felt the thrill of freedom, not the fragile escape she had sought by running from town, but a wild, pulsing freedom that seemed to sing in her blood. When they stopped atop a ridge, the view stole her words. Below, the desert rolled in endless waves of rock and sand, painted gold by the sinking sun. Lone Hawk watched her, not the view, his gaze drawn to the awe written across her face. She looked alive in a way that stirred something long dormant within him. "This land?" she whispered, breathless. "It's not empty at all. It's alive." He inclined his head, a faint trace of approval in his eyes. "You see what most do not." That night, back at the fire, Clara listened as the older women told stories, tales woven with stars and spirits. of warriors who turned into eagles, of rivers born from the tears of mothers. The children leaned in with wide eyes, their laughter ringing like bells when the stories turned playful. Clara's heart ached with a bittersweet wonder. This was a world she had never known, one she had been told to fear, yet here she was, drawn to its rhythm as if it had been waiting for her all along. Later, when the camp grew quiet and the fire sank into embers, she found herself beside Lone Hawk, both of them staring into the endless night sky. The stars burned brighter than any lantern she had ever seen. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Clara's voice, soft but trembling with truth, broke the silence. "Please, don't leave me. I know I shouldn't ask, but—" she swallowed hard. "I don't want to be alone again." The words were dangerous, she knew. She had no right to them. Yet they slipped out, raw and honest, because her heart could no longer cage them. Lone Hawk turned, his gaze locking with hers. His face was shadowed, unreadable, but his hand moved almost without thought. He lifted hers, cradling it between his palms. Her skin was soft against his, fragile and warm. He felt his pulse quicken an unfamiliar rush, a pounding that betrayed the control he prided himself on. He did not answer with words. He did not need to. The steady strength of his grip, the unyielding way his dark eyes held hers, said more than any vow could. Clara's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something far greater. She realized in that moment that love could be found in silence, in a touch, in a glance, in the unspoken promise that someone would not abandon her when she needed them most. And Lone Hawk, though he tried to bury the thought, understood a truth he had long denied. This woman, fragile yet fierce in her longing, had found a way past his defenses. She was no longer merely under his protection. She was becoming part of him. The desert wind sighed through the canyon as if carrying their secret into the night. And under the vast burning sky, a flame had begun to grow small, fragile, but steady, lighting two hearts that had been in darkness for far too long. The days in the canyon had become a strange kind of dream for Clara. She woke to the sound of drums, echoing softly in the distance, to the sight of women weaving or grinding maize, to children darting about with shrieks of laughter. For the first time in her life, she felt her hands were useful, not clumsy. She learned to braid fibers into cord, to fetch water from the spring, to stir broth until its aroma rose rich into the air. But more than that, she had learned the rhythm of Lone Hawk. She could sense when he was near without looking, could hear the faint scrape of his moccasins against stone even over the noise of the camp. His silences no longer intimidated her. They comforted her. He had become her anchor. She had begun to believe, in stolen moments beneath the stars, that perhaps she had found something like belonging. But peace in the desert was always fragile. It began with whispers. A group of Apache scouts returned to camp one evening, their voices sharp with urgency. Clara could not understand their words, but she read the tension in the lines of their faces and the sudden quiet of the women who listened. Lone Hawk stood with the warriors, his arms crossed, his gaze hard as stone. When their meeting ended, he came to her. "What is it?" she asked, her chest tightening. His answer was blunt. "Men from the town are searching. They want you back." Clara's breath caught. Her hands trembled where they gripped the edge of her shawl. "Back? But why? They never wanted me before." Lone Hawk's jaw tightened. "Not out of care. Out of pride. They say you belong to them. To take you back is to prove power." The words made her stomach twist. She could see their faces even now, men who had mocked her, dismissed her, laughed when she dared to dream of more. They had not wanted her then, but now they wanted to drag her back as though she were no more than property. Her throat constricted. "What will they do if they find me?" His silence was answer enough. That night Clara could not sleep. She lay awake beneath the woven hides of the lodge, staring at the glow of embers and listening to the steady rise and fall of the desert wind. Every sound beyond the camp made her startle. The cry of a night bird, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. She curled into herself, whispering prayers she had long ago abandoned. At dawn, she found Lone Hawk sharpening his knife, the muscles in his forearm flexing as the blade slid against stone. His expression was unreadable, but the air around him felt heavier than usual. She hesitated before stepping closer. "Do you want me to go back?" she asked softly. His head lifted, and for a moment she thought she saw pain flicker in his eyes. Then he shook his head. "It is not what I want. It is what may keep you safe." Her breath caught. Safe? I was never safe there. Not once in my life. With them, I was nothing. With you, she faltered, her throat tightening. With you, I feel like I matter. Lone Hawk's gaze locked with hers, steady and fierce. He wanted to tell her that she mattered more than he dared admit, but words had never been his way. Instead, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering at her cheek. For a moment, the world fell silent, and all that remained was the heat of his palm and the rapid beat of her heart. But then a horn's echo, carried faint across the canyon. The sound was distant, but unmistakable, the call of riders. Lone Hawk's body went taut, every line of him sharpened into readiness. "They are near," he said. Fear swept through Clara, cold and suffocating. She clutched his arm. "Don't let them take me." His hand covered hers, firm and unyielding. "They will not." And yet she could feel the unspoken truth in the air. The fragile peace they had found was breaking. The desert had given them time, but the outside world had not forgotten them. The storm she had fled from was closing in, and this time it threatened not just her, but the man who had become her salvation. As the sun rose over the canyon walls, painting the world in fire, Clara knew the days of quiet were over. The desert, which had healed her wounds, was about to test her love. The canyon felt different that morning. The air was tense, sharpened, as though every rock and shadow held its breath. Clara had grown used to the rhythm of life in Lone Hawk's camp, the laughter of children, the steady drum of work, the songs rising with the firelight. But now those familiar sounds were hushed, replaced by the murmur of warriors preparing, the scrape of stone against arrowheads, the tightening of saddle straps. She watched as Lone Hawk stood among them, his presence commanding without need for words. He moved like a blade honed for battle, calm, lethal, inevitable. Every gesture spoke of duty, every breath of readiness. She had seen strength in him before, but now she saw the warrior, the man who had been shaped by fire and blood. Clara's chest tightened. He was preparing to fight for her. When their eyes met across the camp, she saw what he would not say aloud. "Go. Leave now while you can." The weight of it pressed into her, almost more than she could bear. She rose from where she had been sitting, her legs unsteady, and crossed the camp toward him. "You want me to run, don't you?" she whispered when she was close enough. His gaze held hers, dark and steady. "If you stay, they will kill me." Her throat constricted. The words cut sharp, as if he had already accepted his fate. She shook her head, her voice breaking. "No. No, I can't leave you. You must." His tone was firm, but beneath it she heard something raw, a plea, not for himself, but for her survival. "They will not stop until they drag you back. If you are gone, they have no reason to fight." Clara's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She thought of the town, the jeers, the cruel whispers, the loneliness that had suffocated her for years. To return meant going back to that cage, to a life where she was nothing but a burden. She thought of her father's empty eyes, the men who laughed when she dared to dream, the constant ache of never belonging. Then she thought of this place, of the laughter of children running past her, of the women who, though wary at first, had begun to share their work with her, guiding her hands, showing her patience. She thought of Lone Hawk, of his silence that spoke more than words ever could, of the way his hand had lifted hers when she was at her weakest, of the fire in his eyes when he promised, "They will not take you." Her choice was clear. Clara stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Her voice shook, but her words were fierce. "I'd rather die with you than live without you." The confession hung in the air, fragile yet blazing. Lone Hawk's eyes flickered, as though her words had broken through armor he had worn all his life. His hand rose slowly, almost hesitantly, to her face. His thumb brushed her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You do not know what you ask," he said, his voice low, almost hoarse. "Yes, I do." Her hand covered his, pressing it to her skin. "All my life people left me. My father, the townsfolk, everyone, but not you. You stayed. You saw me, and I will not walk away from that. Not now." His breath caught. For a man who had endured battlefields and loss, nothing had ever undone him like this moment, the sight of her fragile but unyielding, choosing him not out of fear, but out of love. For the first time since he was a boy, Lone Hawk felt the iron walls around his heart shatter. He bent his forehead to hers, closing his eyes, letting himself feel what he had long forbidden. Her trembling breath mingled with his, and in that silence a vow passed between them unspoken. Unbreakable dot when he pulled back, his eyes burned with resolve. "Then we fight, together." Clara's fear remained, but it no longer ruled her. She nodded, her hand still clutching his. The canyon echoed with the distant thunder of hooves. Dust rose on the horizon where riders approached, carrying with them the world she had fled. The warriors of Lone Hawk's people readied themselves, bows strung, knives gleaming. Clara stood among them, no longer the fragile girl who had stumbled into the desert half dead, begging not to be left behind. She was a woman who had made her choice, a choice of love, of defiance, of belonging. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The riders came with the rising sun, their silhouettes black against the horizon. Dust plumed beneath their hooves, carrying the bitter scent of iron and sweat. Clara's heart lurched as she counted them, at least a dozen, maybe more. Armed men, their rifles glinting in the morning light, faces set with grim determination. They were men from town, the same ones who had sneered when she walked their streets, who now came as if she were their possession to reclaim. Lone Hawk stood at the front of the canyon's mouth, bow in hand, his body poised like a blade drawn and waiting. His warriors flanked him, silent, steady, their faces painted with the calm ferocity of those who had known battle before. The air was heavy with expectation, as though even the desert itself held still to witness what would unfold. Clara stood a few paces behind him. Her legs trembled, but she did not move. Fear gnawed at her, but beneath it pulsed something stronger, defiance. This time she would not run. The riders slowed as they neared, fanning out into a line. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a red kerchief at his throat, raised a hand. His voice carried across the canyon. "Hand her over," he called. "The girl don't belong to you savages. She belongs to her people." Clara's blood turned hot at the words. Her people? These were the same men who had mocked her, discarded her, who had only noticed her absence when it became a matter of pride. She wanted to scream that she did not belong to them, that she had found more of a home in the silence of the canyon than she ever had in town. But Lone Hawk spoke before she could. "She belongs to no man." His voice rang out, deep and unyielding. "And she will not return with you." The leader spat into the dirt. Then you'll all bleed for it." Time fractured. The riders surged forward, rifles raising. In the same breath, Lone Hawk lifted his bow, releasing an arrow that struck the lead rider square in the chest. The man toppled backward, his horse rearing, throwing chaos into the charge. The canyon erupted. Gunfire cracked, arrows hissed through the air, horses screamed. Clara stumbled back as warriors darted forward, swift as shadows, their cries piercing the din. Dust and smoke blurred her vision, but she could still see Lone Hawk moving like water, fluid and deadly. He loosed arrows with precision, each one finding its mark. When a rider broke through the line, he dropped his bow and met him with a knife. Swift and unrelenting, Clara's breath came in gasps. She wanted to hide, to cover her ears, but she forced herself to stay upright. Then she saw a rider veer toward her, his pistol drawn, eyes wild with fury. Fear clawed at her throat, but her feet refused to move. "Clara!" Lone Hawk's voice cut through the chaos. Before the shot could fire, Lone Hawk was there, tackling the rider from his horse. The gun went off, the sound deafening in her ears, but the bullet struck stone. Lone Hawk drove his blade into the man's side, sending him crumpling into the dust. His chest heaved, his dark eyes flashing toward Clara. "Stay close to me." Her legs moved before she thought, carrying her to his side. Her hand brushed his arm, grounding herself in his presence even as the world roared around them. The battle raged. Warriors darted between the rocks, striking, vanishing, striking again. Several riders broke and fled, their courage crumbling under the ferocity of the defense. The leader remained, shouting orders, firing wildly. His rage was not for victory. It was for pride. Clara watched as Lone Hawk met him head on. The two clashed with a fury that seemed to shake the earth itself. The leader swung his rifle like a club, but Lone Hawk ducked, driving his knife across the man's arm. The rifle fell, and in a final surge, Lone Hawk struck him down. Silence crept into the canyon, broken only by the whinny of frightened horses and the groans of the defeated. The dust hung heavy in the air, glowing red in the morning light. Slowly, the remaining riders turned tail, fleeing back the way they had come. Clara's knees nearly gave out. Her ears still rang with the echoes of gunfire, her body shaking with the aftershock of terror. But when Lone Hawk turned to her, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion, she saw no fear in his eyes, only certainty. She threw herself into his arms, clinging to him with every ounce of strength she had left. Tears streaked her cheeks as she buried her face against him. "I thought," her voice broke, "I thought they'd take you from me." His hand came to rest at the back of her head, holding her close. His heart still thundered from the fight, but not from battle alone. For in her words, he heard the truth he could no longer deny. She was no longer a stranger in his world. She was his. The desert had been painted with fire and blood that morning, but beneath the endless sky, love had stood its ground. The canyon was quiet now. The clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, the echo of gunfire, all had faded into memory. What remained was the hush of wind moving through the rocks and the faint cry of a hawk circling high above. Clara stood at the edge of the battleground, her dress torn, her hair tangled with dust and sweat. Her body trembled, though whether from fear or relief, she couldn't tell. Around her, Lone Hawk's warriors moved among the fallen, gathering weapons, tending to the wounded. Their voices were low, solemn. A fight was never taken lightly, even in victory, and it had been a victory. Against the odds, they had stood and the riders had fled. The town men had come with the arrogance of ownership, believing they could claim her back, but they had been driven away. Driven away not because of her strength, but because Lone Hawk had refused to abandon her. She turned to him now. He stood a short distance away, tall and still, his chest marked with blood, some his, some not. His dark hair clung to his temples, and his knife was still sheathed with dust and red. But his eyes, when they found hers, were steady. Clara moved toward him. Every step felt like the crossing of a threshold. When she reached him, she didn't hesitate. She reached for his hand. His palm was rough, his fingers calloused from a lifetime of battle and work. When their hands touched, something surged through her, a quiet, certain knowing. She looked up at him, her throat tight with emotion. "They'll come again," she whispered. "Won't they?" His gaze lingered on the horizon where the riders had vanished. "Perhaps. Men who fear losing power always return." His thumb brushed her hand, almost absently, as though he wasn't aware of the tenderness in the gesture. Then his eyes returned to hers. "But next time they will not find you afraid." She felt a tear slide down her cheek. "Not if you're beside me." The corner of his mouth shifted, the faintest hint of something like a smile. It was not joy, it was something deeper, steadier. A vow unspoken. That night, the fire burned higher than usual in the canyon. The people gathered, singing low songs of strength and mourning, honoring those who had fought, remembering those who had fallen. Clara sat among them, her heart both heavy and light. For the first time, she was not a shadow at the edge of a gathering. Women offered her food. Men nodded in acknowledgement. Children tugged at her hands as though she belonged among them. She glanced across the fire and found Lone Hawk watching her. Not as a warrior watches over a charge, but as a man looks upon something precious, something he has chosen. The intensity of it made her breath falter. Later, when the fire had burned low and the songs had faded into the hum of crickets, she found him waiting at the edge of the canyon. The moon bathed the rocks in silver, and the desert stretched out before them, endless and untamed. She approached him quietly. "Why me?" she asked at last, her voice fragile in the stillness. "You could have let me go, and all of this." She gestured toward the battleground. Toward the firelight behind them. None of it would have happened. He turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "Because the day I lifted your hand," he said, his voice low, steady, "my heart remembered what it had forgotten, that even a warrior must choose something worth fighting for. I chose you." The words unraveled something deep within her. For years, she had lived believing she was unwanted, a burden too heavy for anyone to bear. Now standing under the desert sky, with the man who had risked everything to keep her safe, she felt the truth burn inside her. She was not unwanted. She was chosen. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Then I choose you too." His hand rose, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible after the violence of the day. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then he leaned down, his forehead brushing hers, his breath mingling with hers in the quiet night. No vows were spoken, no promises carved into stone. Yet in that moment, under the endless sky, something eternal passed between them. Not ownership, not rescue, but love pure, fierce, unbreakable. The desert wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage and fire. Tomorrow would bring more trials, more battles, more whispers from the world that sought to divide them. But tonight, Clara stood with Lone Hawk, her hand in his, and knew she would never again be left behind. For together, they had chosen a new beginning.